Okay, finally, good morning. I'm sorry about the lateness of this. I left the house this morning without my mask, and I got halfway to the SkyTrain station, and of course, can't ride SkyTrain with no mask, so I had to turn around, go back, get the mask, then go to the SkyTrain station. Then I had some technological difficulties here with my streaming software, but that has been sorted out. So finally, we can begin. Hopefully that's all the disasters that will happen today. Sometimes they say bad things come in threes, so I don't know, maybe there's one more bad thing, but hopefully not. Okay, let's not waste any more time. Let's jump in here. So yesterday we were talking about the social construction of race in Canada, right? And I said that, it was very easy to kind of point the finger at the United States and say, ooh, racism, right? But, whoops, I'm sorry. Ooh, racism down there. But of course, Canada in some ways is no different. Canada has been created as a race-based society as well. And again, we advertise ourselves as a very multicultural, tolerant, welcoming place. And again, there is truth to that. There is truth to that advertising. But there's also other things that have happened in the past and continue to happen in the present that we need to adjust, right? And again, we could focus on a number of different groups in Canada. Certainly, Black Canadians face prejudice and discrimination. Asian Canadians are increasingly facing discrimination and hate crimes even, probably linked to the coronavirus pandemic, but who knows why there's an uptick in hate crimes toward Asian Canadians and Asian Americans, right? And so, Mulder, did you want to say something, or you have an expression on your face? Are you sure? Because you can say it. Okay. We could certainly focus on many different kind of racially identified groups, but here we're going to look at Indigenous people in Canada. And so I said that Indigenous people of Canada are First Nations or First People because they were the first ones here, right? And their ancestors came here maybe in the neighborhood of around 12 to 14,000 years ago. They moved in from kind of northeastern Asia, what's now kind of Siberia or Russia. And these people kind of spread throughout North and South America and eventually kind of created all of the cultures that we had in the Americas. I said there were many different cultures that appeared, different languages, different religions, different ways of living, different technologies to access food resources and to keep these people warm and dry and healthy and happy. We kind of we kind of place these people into one basket as Indigenous people, but really it's a very diverse group of cultures. And again, depending on where you are in Canada or depending on where you are in North or South America, you see lots of different cultures, languages. It's really very diverse and very rich. Here's Canada, of course, but I said that we start our story a little bit earlier when Canada was not a country. It was just kind of an area that people referred to. If I'm not mistaken, Canada comes from an Indigenous word for village. I think the word is Kanata, and so that meant village. And so eventually the colonists who came here started talking about Canada very often, and they sort of eventually turned that into the name of the country. There's another really bad joke that says, how did they come up with the name of Canada? Well, they drew letters out of a hat. And so they're like, okay, what's the first letter? C, eh? N, eh? It's a stupid joke, right? That's why they don't tell it anymore, because it's stupid. But anyway, that's the joke. So anyway, Canada, we start out when Canada was not a country. And again, we said that there were colonists coming here, but there were also explorers and traders trading with indigenous people, mostly for furs, which Europe wanted to make hats out of. And so again, it was a fairly equal relationship to begin with. Again, because indigenous people vastly outnumbered white Europeans, and so, white Europeans kind of had to watch their behavior. They were really in the house of indigenous people, and again, if they, behaved poorly, they might get themselves into trouble. Unfortunately, that dynamic started to shift, even beginning in the 1600s, because indigenous people were suddenly exposed to diseases that Europeans brought with them, and again, they had no immunity, because tuberculosis, smallpox, measles, diseases like that evolved in Europe, and people in Europe had developed some degree of immunity to them, but indigenous people had never seen those diseases before, and so they had no immunity, and huge numbers of indigenous people die from disease in the centuries, I guess, following the discovery of the New World. I showed you some pictures yesterday, and these were kind of not artwork from the time, but they're kind of artwork from later. But they kind of show a much more equal relationship, or certainly not a relationship where white Europeans are the ones in power. And here, the indigenous people are kind of hearing what this sort of white military guy has to say. He looks very non-threatening. He's holding out his hand saying, "Hey, I come in peace," right? And the indigenous people are kind of sitting there looking like, what's this guy all about? What's he want?
I also have a question about
Sure.
that guy. He showed one hand saying that, "Hey, I'm not going to look like anything until you." So what about this guy?
Well, it's just kind of hanging by his side, but that's kind of that's a traditional kind of thing to do, right? It's to show people that you have no weapons in your hands, right? And I think that's where the handshake comes from. The handshake means, yeah, I'm shaking hands with you, I don't have a weapon, right? Unless you're left-handed, but it's another thing. So it's just kind of a gesture of friendship, of peace. And again, the indigenous people don't seem too upset. They're kind of looking at this guy and kind of wondering what he's about and what he has to say, right? Here again, you see a fairly equal relationship. You see some guys trading furs here, probably some traders or some merchants from the Hudson's Bay Company trading with this indigenous guy, right? And everyone's just kind of sitting around having a smoke, trading some furs. You know how it is, right? Don't you guys do that? Friday night, hang around, smoke, and trade furs with your friends? No, just teasing. Nobody trades furs, right? So again, we had a fairly equal relationship to begin with, but the introduction of disease starts to kind of damage indigenous cultures and certainly decrease the number of indigenous people that are on the continent. I pointed this out yesterday. It seems like a minor detail, but it's really not. A proclamation from, I think, King George in 1763, where he basically admits that indigenous people have title to this land. This land belongs to them, right? And so if colonists coming here want to buy land from indigenous people, the king says, nope, can't do that. The crown, the British government will not recognize that sale. You have to get the land through us. We will acquire the land from the indigenous people, right? So again, they kind of admit that the land actually does belong to indigenous people. But again, we've got population loss through kind of epic pandemic disease. We've got the slaughtering of the bison, right? And so we said these massive, badass cow-looking animals used to roam central Canada and the central United States. Millions upon millions of them. Massive, massive herds of bison used to roam. But white Europeans shot them all, right? And governments handed out bounties. So you got paid for the number of bison that you shot. And again, they didn't use the meat, they just left them, right? They just got paid. And so you see pictures like this. This isn't the only such picture of a giant mound of bison skulls. But again, you can't have farmland in central Canada with all of these massive creatures running around, right? They'll trample all of your crops. And so the government shoots them all. But of course, we mentioned that Indigenous people relied on these animals, right? They got almost everything they needed from the bison, and they used every part of it. So think of a giant cow-like animal. The Indigenous people used every part of that animal. They either ate it or they made tools out of it. Every piece was utilized. But here they were destroyed, right? And so again, what do you do as an Indigenous person now that the thing that you depended on is gone? Well, Indigenous people start to make agreements with the government, right? So this is, here you can see the date. We're in the mid 1800s. So it's been a 250 years since white Europeans started coming to Canada. So it's been a bit of a history. That's true. It's been about 150 years. That's right. It's been about 150 years since Indigenous people, or since white Europeans came to Canada. But I mean, things are changing, right? And the Indigenous people are not stupid. They can see that life is changing. They can see that these Europeans continue to come to their land, and they're not going to stop coming, right? They're going to keep coming, and they're going to be there permanently, right? These people are setting up farms and towns. They're building railways. The first railway that stretches all the way across Canada, I think, is completed in 1888 or 1889. So that railway is in construction when some of these things are happening. Incidentally, this is actually where that railway ended, here in Vancouver. And so it started all the way out in the east, sort of by Toronto, Montreal kind of thing. And that railway carried all the way across basically to right here. This was the end of the line. So Indigenous people know that the world is changing, things are going to be different, and they're going to have to adapt, right? Some of their food sources are gone, their ability to access food and move around has been compromised, and so they go to the government and say, hey, let's talk about this, let's make a deal, let's formalize some sort of relationship here. Let's figure out how our people and your people are going to live here together, because clearly we need an arrangement, right? And so what they do, mostly in central Canada, although in a few other places too, is they sign treaties, okay? And treaty is kind of it's an official document, right? It's an official signed document, but it's also kind of it's a document that talks about a relationship, right? So it means that we have a relationship, we have a responsibility to each other, okay? At least that's how the Indigenous people thought of it. And so here's what Indigenous people wanted from these treaties. They wanted to ensure the physical survival of their people, right? Again, their way of life was compromised. They had lost the bison. They had people setting up towns and things like that. And so they wanted to make sure that their people would continue to be able to live here. They wanted to establish a sort of peaceful, mutual respect relationship with this new kind of government of Canada that was forming, or that had just formed. And so they wanted some sort of official recognition of that relationship. They wanted to ensure the survival of their culture and their spiritual life by kind of maintaining their own way of life and their own system of governance, okay? And of course, they wanted to transition to this new phase of history. And so this is often something that gets shown as kind of a symbol of what indigenous people wanted from treaties. And so this is basically a belt that's made out of beads. Okay, so the beads are kind of woven together. Indigenous people are quite good at this sort of thing, at making patterns with beadwork, whether it's on clothing or whatever. This is a belt, and it's symbolic of something. What do you think this? What do you think the symbolism is here? What does this? What is being represented here? What's that? Quantity? Equality? Yeah, okay, but how? Okay, so there's two parallel lines, and they are kind of not, they're the same, yeah. Good. What else might it symbolize? Think of indigenous people's connection to the natural world. It's not as hard as you think it is. What does blue often represent? Yeah, it often represents water. So here we see basically two rivers, right? And so indigenous people were basically saying, this is how we'll exist in Canada. You'll paddle your canoe, and we'll paddle our canoes, and we'll paddle down our own rivers. But we'll be going in the same direction, and we'll have a friendly relationship, but we'll kind of be doing our own thing, right? We'll each be doing our own thing, each looking after our own affairs, with a good relationship between us. That's kind of what they're thinking. But unfortunately for indigenous people, the Canadian government had a different approach to these treaties. And so really what they were trying to do here was to acquire the legal title to land. Okay? They basically wanted to buy land. Now, this is kind of a problem for indigenous people because, again, indigenous people don't really have a concept of land ownership. It doesn't make sense within their sort of traditional culture and belief structure, right? And so again, you know, the indigenous people feel like sometimes that they belong to the land, or that the land is something that takes care of them, almost like their mother, or something that they are kind of interconnected with in terms of the land and the plants and the animals, and everybody's kind of part of this one system. And so indigenous people don't see, you know, the idea that you could draw a square on the ground and say this is mine and it's not yours, that doesn't make any sense within their sort of cultural worldview. Of course, for us it makes total sense because we're very used to that concept, but to them it doesn't make any sense, right? Can you own your mother? No, you can't do that, right? Can you own the air? This is my air, you can't have any of it? No, it's ridiculous, right? And so similarly, indigenous people feel the same way. You can't own land, it's ridiculous, right? You can't own it. You can belong to it, you can be the guardians of it, you can have rights to enter the land or to be on the land, but you cannot own it. It's just not, this is not a thing, right? But of course, for the Canadian government, they're like, yeah, we want to buy this stuff, sign here, right? So you have very different kind of worldviews colliding. So the Canadian government's trying to buy this land because, again, they want to settle the West, right? If you go back to, this is 23. If you go back here, yeah, if you go back here, this is kind of where Canada is in 1867. And so our founding fathers, John A. Macdonald, our first prime minister, who was one of them, he had this dream of a nation that stretched from sea to shining sea, right? And so, again, they were able to establish a kind of a country, of course, under the protection of Great Britain, but they were able to establish a country here of Canada in the east, but they wanted a country that stretched all the way. And so Of course, they had to entice British Columbia to enter their federation, to enter the country, but they also had to fill that center section, because really there was nobody there, right? Scratch that. There were no white Europeans there. There was lots of indigenous people there, and formerly lots of bison, but there were no Europeans. And so what the government started to do was try to buy that land from indigenous people so that they could push them out of the way and then bring in a bunch of European immigrants to farm central Canada. Okay. They were also trying to build this country from sea to sea, but of course they were also trying to keep the Americans out, because the Americans were in the process of doing the same thing. The Americans were in the process of settling the West, and so this is kind of, for them, this is kind of their Old West period, you know, with like cowboys and gunslingers and stuff like that. That's kind of what's going on down there, although probably in a less Hollywood kind of way. But that's what's happening for them in the United States. And so the Canadian government was like, look, we don't want people moving north and coming into what we want as Canada, because if we get these Americans in there, it'll be impossible to get them out. We'll have to fight a war. It'll be a whole thing. So let's just settle our people in there first, so the Americans will kind of stay down there. And so again, the Canadian government is trying to get this, to settle that central part of Canada. Interestingly, as a side note, the first immigrants that they recruit are mostly British immigrants, because of course they want Canada to be a white British Christian country, and so they recruit a bunch of British immigrants and settle them in central Canada and try to set them up on farms and get them farming. Unfortunately, it doesn't work, because they all kind of chicken out after a couple years because it's too cold, it's too miserable, and so they all leave. And so the Canadian government starts to recruit immigrants from other places, particularly from like Sweden, Norway kind of area, and also from Eastern Europe. And so central Canada, particularly Alberta, has a pretty large population of Ukrainians, of ethnic Ukrainians, and that was where Canada was pulling immigrants from in this period, because the Ukrainians were actually tough enough to, you know, last through the winters and to farm in difficult conditions, and the Brits were too, hey, it's bloody cold here, and then they went home, and that was kind of it. But anyway, that was a bit of a side note. So yeah, this is what the Canadian government wanted to do. And so as you can see, they have pretty different goals, and they have pretty different worldviews about what they can actually, what they were actually doing here. Again, Indigenous people were saying, yeah, let's build a relationship, right? We'll sign a treaty, but then we'll continue to build on that relationship and negotiate it and talk it out, right? Whereas the Canadian government was like, you know what, sign here, and then we'll own the land and have a nice day, right? So the Canadian government was much more interested in a commercial business transaction. Indigenous people were looking to build relationship, right? To create some sort of relationship. So here's kind of what these treaties basically were. So they were an agreement between the Canadian government and First Nations people. And First Nations people basically said that, or they thought they said, okay, you Canadians can come, you white Europeans can come and live on our land, you can farm and set up villages and do whatever you want. And in compensation, we First Nations people will get this. So we will get reserve lands, we will get land so that we can continue to practice our way of life. We'll get farm animals and equipment, because we want to farm too, and we've never really done this, so we want you to provide farm equipment. Annual payments were supposed to go from the government to Indigenous people for the right to be on the land. They wanted education for their children, right? So again, Indigenous people are not foolish, right? They understand that the world is changing, and they also understood that if their children were going to live in the world of tomorrow, they were going to need skills that Indigenous people didn't really have, right? And so, for instance, Indigenous people didn't read or write things. They didn't really need to write things down, but they recognized that their children would need to be able to do that, right? To live in that world of the future. And so, yeah, they asked for education for their kids. As for ammunition, so bullets for their guns, clothing, and of course the continual right to hunt and fish on their traditional lands, right? That's what they thought was kind of going on here. As it turned out, this is another side story. As it turned out, the Indigenous people were really good negotiators. And so the government agents would come to one group of Indigenous people and say, okay, let's negotiate a treaty. And so they'd be negotiating and they'd finally come to an agreement. But in the room with them, or in the tent with them, was a person from like another tribe. And so when the negotiations were done, the person from that tribe would go home to his own village. And then when the government agents came to that village, the Indigenous people would say, okay, we know what you gave those last people, that's where we're going to start, but we want more. So yeah, it turns out they were good negotiators. Spoiler alert, they're going to get screwed over anyway, but they did a good job. They did a good job of negotiating.
I mean, that was supposed.
What's that?
That was supposed. What was supposed? So it tells everything. They were supposed to do that, but I see what they did.
They did not, but we'll get to that very shortly. Well, we'll get to that right now. So one of the things that came out of this, of course, is that, you know, treaties were originally negotiated and they were signed, but keep in mind that Indigenous people couldn't actually read. They didn't know how to read, and so these documents that they originally signed, they couldn't actually read the final version of them. And again, if you're going to sign a contract, you should always read it before you sign it, especially the fine print, right? But again, Indigenous people couldn't do that for themselves. And they couldn't sign their names either. Most of them are signed with an X because they don't write. They're not a culture that writes. And so what Indigenous people kind of found out later was a lot of the things they negotiated actually didn't show up in the final version of the contract. So the final version of the contract that they signed was not reflective of the negotiations that they originally had. And so that was an initial problem. Good morning. The other issue that came up is that it quickly became clear that the Canadian government didn't really have any intention of honoring all of these promises. And so what happened actually over time was that the first Indigenous groups to sign treaties, they got to negotiate. But as time went on, Indigenous people became more and more desperate to make an agreement with the government. And so later on, there was really no negotiating happening at all, because the government knew that Indigenous people were desperate. Their communities were suffering from disease and population loss. In central Canada, they were suffering because there was no more bison, so they had nothing to eat. And so these people were really struggling, and so they were desperate for some kind of formalized relationship with the government. And so, again, negotiations stopped at that point because the government knew they didn't have to negotiate, that these people would just sign whatever treaty was put in front of them, right? And it was true, right? That, you know, Indigenous people did sign these treaties, but again, they couldn't read them. Often the final version of the contract wasn't what they negotiated in the first place. These two groups had very different worldviews in terms of what the document actually said and what it meant. And of course, the Canadian government didn't really have any intention of honoring their side of the bargain, right? And so there's kind of a long quote here, but I'll just draw your attention to the last one. So yeah, so this is the end of a non-negotiation. So when they parted company, the commissioners, the government agents, had a document which said that the Blackfoot had surrendered their lands. The chiefs, on the other hand, believed that they had been promised protection for the buffalo herds and treaty money for allowing the white man to come into their ancestral grounds. Yet, neither side really understood what they had given away. To Laird, the government guy, buffalo preservation and firewood compensation were minor considerations not to be taken seriously. To the chiefs, the selling of the land and the allotment of the reserves was beyond their comprehension. Right? So again, these two sides made a deal, one kind of in bad faith, the other one thinking that their terms would be honored, but again, they're really, literally and figuratively, these two groups are not speaking the same language. Right? They have very different ideas of what they're actually signing on to. And so Indigenous people had these treaties, but the next thing that kind of came down the pike for them was was the Indian Act. And the Indian Act was passed by the Canadian government. You can see here in 1876. I have some extra detail that you don't really need to know. It was kind of there was a few other acts, laws that came before it, gradual civilization and gradual enfranchisement, and they kind of put them together and added some stuff and turned it into the Indian Act. And the Indian Act is, and they continue to add to it after 1876. The Indian Act is a law, it's a long one, it's like pages and pages and pages and pages, that formalizes the relationship between Indigenous people and the Canadian government. And it does so in a way that puts the Canadian government in control of a lot of aspects of these people's lives in a way that they're not in control of regular Canadians' lives. And secondly, the Indian Act was created to assimilate Indigenous people into Canada as a whole. What does assimilate mean? To merge them together, right? I think it comes from the same root word sim, like similar. To make similar. To assimilate is to make things the same, right? And that's what the function of the Indian Act was. And so there was lots of parts of it that said what Indigenous people could and couldn't do. There was rules about who was technically Indigenous, because Indigenous people were supposed to get special rights and were supposed to get payments, right? But the government controlled who was Indigenous and who wasn't. So remember back when I asked you that question, what race are you and who gets to decide? And I think a lot of us said, well, you get to decide or society gets to decide. But here it's the government that gets to decide. Are you an Indigenous person? Well, ask the government, right? And if you are an Indigenous person, you get a card. You get an ID card that says you are a status Indian. You have status. But there are many Indigenous people who do not have status. They don't have the card. Therefore, the government doesn't recognize them as Indigenous. Therefore, they don't get any of the benefits that are coming to them. Not that they're that great, but they still don't. More and more things got to be added on to this Indian Act. Things like Indigenous people couldn't leave their reserve without permission from the Indian agent. So the government had a guy in charge of that Indian reserve telling the Indigenous people whether or not they could leave their reservation, right? Sounds like being imprisoned. Sounds like being under house arrest to me. But anyway, they were not allowed to appear in their traditional clothing without a permit. Traditional ceremonies that they used to have, sun dances, potlatches, they were made illegal. They were banned. They weren't allowed to undertake them. So this is just a minor selection. There's a long list. They created a system whereby if an indigenous woman, if a status Indian, if she married a non-indigenous man, she would lose her Indian status, and her kids would lose their status as well. Okay? So, or they would not have status. And so, because of this, the only way to create more indigenous people was to have indigenous people marry indigenous people. So it had the effect of A, encouraging indigenous women not to marry white men, but also it had the effect of reducing over time the number of status Indians that actually existed, right? Because if a woman is a status Indian, if she doesn't marry another person with status, she loses her status and her kids don't have status either. Right? And so, again, over time, slowly, the number of indigenous people, the number of status Indians in your country decreases to the point where you don't have any. Right? And that wasn't an accident. That wasn't, whoops, we didn't think of that. In fact, they did think of that. And here, you can see this is the head of the Department of Indian Affairs. So this is the guy who's in charge of Indigenous people's welfare in Canada in 1893. He says this. He says, I want to get rid of the Indian problem. Whenever you hear a problem that starts with a racial or ethnic group, the problem is always, how do we make these people go away? That's the problem, right? In Germany in the 1930s, they had the Jewish problem or the Jewish question, right? And that's always what the problem is. How do we make these people go away? And so here, Duncan Campbell Scott, a member of the Canadian government, says, I want to get rid of the Indian problem. Our object is to continue until there is not a single Indian in Canada that has not been absorbed, assimilated, into the body politic. And there is no Indian question and no Indian department, and that is the whole objective of this bill, right? So far from wanting to preserve their culture or preserve a relationship with Indigenous people, Duncan Campbell Scott here wants them to go away somehow, right?
Indian question is the same as Indian problem.
Yeah.
I always thought these like questions related to Indian and all that.
You always thought it was?
Questions related to Indigenous culture.
Well, one might have questions about Indigenous culture, but usually when you hear governments talk about, you know, the Indian problem, the immigration problem, the Jewish problem or the Jewish question or the this question, it's always a question of how do we get rid of these people? How do we make these people go away? That's always the question, and it certainly is the question here. Duncan Campbell Scott is saying, how do we make these people go away? How do we make this so that we have no Indians left in Canada? And so here they've created an Indian Act that encourages Indigenous people to assimilate, right? Don't practice your traditional ceremonies. Don't appear in public in your traditional clothing. Don't leave your reserve. If you want to vote, well, you'll have to take certain steps and you'll have to give up your status, right? If you want to marry a white man, you'll have to give up your status. All of these things serve to encourage Indigenous people to abandon their traditional culture and their traditional ways of life and become Canadian, whatever that means. Of course, they'll never be Canadian enough, right? They'll always, even those who try to assimilate will face discrimination and racism. So it's a catch-22 when you're talking about assimilation, right? Is that, you know, if you don't assimilate, people will discriminate against you and be racist toward you. But even if you try to assimilate, you'll still have to deal with a certain amount of racism. There's no way out of it in this case. So again, this act, which of course Indigenous people did not negotiate, the government just wrote it and passed it, was designed to abolish any power they had, their right to govern themselves, their right to kind of run their own lives, and attempted to basically destroy their culture, right, as best it could. Probably, well, you don't want to get into listing the worst things to come out of this, but probably the worst thing to come out of this are Indian residential schools. I can talk about this. Do you want to take a little bit of a break now, even though we had a late start, or do you want to keep going? What's that? Break? No break? No break? Okay. All right. So, probably the worst thing to come out of the Indian Act are these Indian residential schools, and again, the schools themselves were a response to Indigenous people's request for education. Right? I said that they're not foolish people. They know that their kids need an education to succeed in the world, just like your parents probably believe right now, and just like my parents believed as well, right? All of our parents want education for our children, and similarly, Indigenous people are no different in this regard. They wanted that as well. Unfortunately, the education that they had requested and were hoping for is not the kind of education that they got. You can see here, this picture, this is a popular picture when talking about Indian residential schools. And you can see there's a lot going on. This is the same child. So this is a young boy who attended an Indian residential school, you can see in Saskatchewan in 1874. He arrived looking like that, right? So there he is in his traditional Indigenous clothing, traditional hairstyle. That's who he is. It doesn't mention his name because they gave him a new name, right? Thomas Moore, of course, is a Christian name, and so they took away his Indigenous name and referred to him as Thomas, right? And so they cut his hair and dressed him up in a kind of a suit, and the assimilation process began, right? Yeah. So these schools were all boarding schools. So of course students went there to live and to study, kind of like Hogwarts, except the exact opposite of Hogwarts in every possible way. And while Indigenous people thought they were sending their children there to get an education so that they could succeed in this new world, really what these children were entering were tools of assimilation by the government. And so the government wasn't really interested in educating them beyond just the base level, right? So these kids were going to get an education that allowed them to read a little bit and to write, and basically to get the lowest jobs in society, right? Whatever the lowest jobs in society are, the ones that pay the least and are the worst and nobody wants to do, those are the ones that these kids are going to get educated for. Nobody from these schools nobody's going to law school from an Indian residential school. They're not getting the quality of education that they need. They're getting the base education. But in addition to that, what they're getting is hardcore assimilation. And so you see that Thomas Moore, I wish I knew his original name, but Thomas Moore there, the assimilation starts on day one, right? When he is stripped of his Indigenous clothing. I suspect they probably burned it. Cut off all his hair, put him into white people clothing, and began this process of assimilation. And so Indigenous kids at these schools were very harshly punished if they did anything connected to their original culture. So if they spoke their own language, if they played a game that was part of their culture, if they practiced any of their traditional beliefs, anything that they tried to do that was connected with their Indigenous culture, they were harshly punished. And when I mean harshly punished, I mean brutally so. About 6,000 kids, as far as we know, about 6,000 kids died at these schools. and you probably know this intuitively, but the correct number of students dying at school is 0, right? There's no allowance for kids dying at school. The number of kids that die at school should always be 0, right? And yet here, there's at least 6,000. But again, some of the records are a little foggy in terms of keeping track of these kids, so that's probably a low number. It's probably more than that. You can see here that about 30% of First Nations kids went to these schools. At first, parents sent them voluntarily because they thought they were going to get a good education, but later on it becomes mandatory, and so they have to send, Indigenous parents have to send their kids to these schools. It's probably worthy of note that these schools were purposely set up hundreds of kilometers away from where these kids originally lived. So the idea is that they're not going home on weekends, right? They go to these schools, they're hundreds of kilometers away from their families and from their people, and they're stuck, right? They're stuck there. There's nowhere for them to go. Again, I won't read through these, but again, the punishments for these the punishments for really anything are super harsh. And again, these schools seem to have attracted the worst of the worst people. And so you had, all kinds of physical, emotional, and sexual abuse happening at these schools. And these schools basically had no oversight. Nobody was watching over them because nobody cared, right? Nobody cared about Indigenous kids, particularly in the government. And so this happened for decades, right? Hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of kids went through these schools where A, they received a substandard education, and B, they were abused, right? In any way that you care to mention, they were abused. Again, it's probably impossible to overstate how brutal these schools actually were. And keep in mind, these are young kids, right? These are just young kids coming into school, 7, 8, 9 years old, right? And they are being brutally punished simply for being Indigenous, right? They are, I don't know who said it. I had the quote a couple of slides back, but what was it? The quote is that the aim of the school was to kill the Indian in the child, right? So it's like an exorcism. It's like, like getting rid of some sort of demon possession or something. And so, these kids were punished simply for being who they were, right? And punished in an absolutely brutal way. Some have suggested that this should be, that this is cultural genocide, is what this is. So the Canadian government purposely attempted to destroy these people's culture. And some people actually drop the cultural part. Some people say that this is actually a genocide that the Canadian government participated in. I will kind of mention this. We talk about this in history a little more, but genocide is kind of a term that in the late 1800s kind of hadn't been invented yet. The term as we use it kind of comes out of the UN's declaration, or the UN Genocide Convention that happened in '48, and it comes after the Holocaust and the sort of horrors of what happened in Nazi Germany. And so again, if you know your history, 5 to 7 million Jewish people are brutally executed by the Nazi regime during World War II and a little bit prior to. And once the Western world kind of gets a full glimpse of what has happened in Nazi Germany, something has to be done, right? Something has to be said. And so the UN has a convention, and they kind of create this term genocide, right? And this is what they say it is. It's the acts committed with the intent to destroy, in whole or in part, a national, ethnic, racial, or religious group. Okay? And you do that by any of the following. So genocides, often we think about people just killing other people. And the Holocaust was certainly like that. 5 to 7 million Jewish people were killed simply for being Jewish. That was their big crime. But you can commit genocide in other ways. You can deliberately impose living conditions that seek to bring about the physical destruction in whole or in part of a people. You can prevent them from reproducing, right? If you sterilize people, then yeah, you're committing a genocide because you're ending that group of people. Or if you forcibly transfer children out of the group into another group. So if you take a group's children and you have them raised by someone else, that's an aspect of genocide as well. You're kind of ending a group of people, right? Because their children will be raised by someone else. So all of these things are part and parcel of genocide. And again, some people have accused Canada of participating in either a cultural genocide, so an attempt to destroy Indigenous culture, or just a regular genocide, which is an attempt to destroy Indigenous people in general, which is kind of a hard pill for some people to swallow, right? Especially because, we have this idea of Canada being, the golden retriever of countries, right? It's nice and polite and it wags its tail a lot, so this is kind of a very stark contrast to how a lot of international people might think of Canada, and also how Canadians themselves think of Canada. And so it's kind of worth, I think, exploring this question, because that's a heavy word, is it not? Genocide? Yeah, you don't just throw that word around lightly. It's a heavy word. What I wanted to do is just have a quick read of an article called "The Ongoing Legacies of Canadian Genocide." And so I have some questions at the end. Basically, they amount to what is this person arguing? You may figure out when you start reading it, but maybe I'll just give you the heads up. It is written by an Indigenous person, so an Indigenous person is writing this article. That's probably worth knowing. But the author is going to make an argument. Do you want to, even without reading it, do you want to guess what the argument might be? Yeah, Canada has committed, or is still in the process of committing, a genocide against Indigenous people, right? So again, you can almost guess what the argument is going to be, and you're correct. That's the conclusion of this argument. But what I want you to do is to read through it, identify some of the premises that her name is Pamela Palmater, that Pamela suggests, and then what do you think that this is? Do you believe this argument? Should we go along with what Pamela says? And what are the consequences if we do believe her argument? And what are the consequences if we don't? Okay, that's what I want. Pardon me. That's what I want you to pay attention to. Okay, so short article. I think it's only a couple pages long or so. But let's read it, and then we'll talk about what evidence Pamela is using to argue her point. Okay, people, we just have a couple minutes left here, but let's see what we can come up with. So I think we've agreed that the argument here is that, you know, we should think of what has happened to Indigenous people in Canada. We should think of that as a genocide. Right? I think that's the obvious conclusion here. But what are some of Pamela's premises? Not kind of the evidence, but the sort of more general premises of why we should think of this as a genocide. What's that? Did you say left? Theft of what? One word is not an answer. Okay. That's okay. So she said that we know that transferring children out of one group to have them raised by another is an aspect of genocide, and we know that to have happened in Canada with Indigenous kids, right? They went to Indian residential schools, and later on, we haven't really gotten to this yet, but lots of them wind up in foster care because they're experiencing violence or drug addiction or alcoholism at home. But we'll get to that. It's true. What else? What's that? Okay, but let's try and think of like the more general patterns in here, because she's got a lot of bullet points and things like that. So let's try and think of the more general things. Premises of Pamela's argument. So the what? Okay, so we can say that Indigenous children have been subjected to violence and pressures to assimilate and have been removed from their original culture in an attempt to end that culture, right? So that's part of it. What else? She talks a little bit about, at the beginning, about intent. What does she say about intent? Yeah, so some people want to say that, oh well, it's not a genocide if you don't succeed, right? And you know, I'm not sure that that's entirely fair. Or if you don't mean to do it, then it's not a genocide. But again, you know, if you are driving your car and you run over someone in the street and you kill them, you know, to some degree, it doesn't really matter whether you meant to or not. The person is still dead, and you are still going to be charged with something. Well, like, you know, the genocide is an attempt to basically destroy, to erase an entire group of people. But that hasn't happened in Canada. We still have Indigenous people and Indigenous cultures here.
And there are still Jewish people.
Yes.
So is that not as successful?
Well, that's yeah. How do you measure success? Success is kind of an ugly term in this context, but that's what Pamela is saying, right? Is that whether the government meant to commit a genocide or not doesn't really so much matter, and it doesn't matter how many people die, and it doesn't matter how successful you are, right? What matters is what actually happens, right? So she's kind of saying that intent doesn't matter, and success is kind of an ugly term here, but success doesn't matter either, right? What matters is what does the government actually do, and how does it affect a particular group of people. What else does she mention? Yeah, so we know that one aspect of genocide is sterilization, is keeping people from reproducing. And we have evidence of that in Canada. It's not super widespread, but there is evidence of people being sterilized simply because they are Indigenous, right? And so that's That's a component of genocide. What else? Actually, that's true. That's something that she doesn't mention in here, but if we had more time, we could look at the 8 stages of genocide. And those 8 stages talk about how a country separates people out, casts one group as, the bad guys, the reasons for all of our problems, and then sets about in a plan to eliminate that group of people. It happens with every genocide. But the last step of that genocide, the last stage, is denial. And you always see at the end of a genocide, people will try to deny it. They'll try to destroy the evidence that it ever happened. They'll pretend that it didn't happen. They'll run away to other countries if they're, powerful people who orchestrated a genocide and then got caught later on. They'll try to flee. People will try to make the memory of that go away, right? And so certainly that's the case here in Canada, is that we haven't talked about this for a long time. We're talking about it now, but decades ago we did not. And it seems like even some very prominent members of the government, I don't know if they have memory problems or what it is, but our former president Stephen Harper went so far as to say we have no history of colonialism in Canada, which is a laughable statement because Canada was a colony of Britain and of France for a little while. So yeah, we do have a history of colonialism here. We are a colonial country, or we were. So again, people will often deny it later on. And so it's worth saying that one of the aspects of genocide is denial at the end. People try to cover the evidence, bury the bodies, convince everyone that it never happened and it's a hoax. And of course, some people still believe that the Holocaust was a hoax, right? That it never happened. It's all just a big story. And again, that's a ridiculous thing to say because there's pretty clear historical evidence that it did happen, but denial is a big part of the final stage of a genocide. And that, to some degree, Canada is guilty of that. Okay, so we're kind of out of time. I just wanted to apologize to you guys for being late. I'm sorry I forgot my mask and I kind of had to go back and get it. And I'm sorry about for online people, we had some technical difficulties this morning too, so I apologize for that. Hopefully the rest of the day will go without issue and there'll be no more disasters, but I guess we'll find out. Have I made contact with other people? In what way? In what way? Without my mask? No. I was outside in the open. I got about maybe a 10-minute walk from the house or so. Then I realized, turned around, got the mask. Yeah, didn't interact with anyone, but couldn't get on the SkyTrain without it. Yes.
I've noticed that the indigenous people have a sort of reddish skin. So when children go to school, are they punished?
I wouldn't say they were so much punished for their skin tone, but they were simply punished for who they were. Who they were and what their culture was like. They were, if they acted in any way that was, non-white, then they were punished for that. I think is probably the short way of describing that. Yeah. I know. That's because I was so discombobulated. I'll do it tomorrow. Okay. Thanks everyone. Have a nice afternoon. I'll see you tomorrow. Don't forget quiz tomorrow. So online people, I'll see you at 8. In-class people, I'll see you at 9. Good luck. Godspeed. I'll see you tomorrow.
Thank you.